Now the Guantanamo angle. We know at least 2 of the Yemeni inmates who've been released from the Gitmo prison camp went on to link up with AQAP, the Al-Qaeda branch in Yemen, and Yemenis make up almost half of the almost 200 prisoners still being held at Gitmo. David Reeves represents 15 of them. He's a lawyer with a human rights practice called Appeal for Justice. We're also joined by terrorism analyst and CIA veteran Larry Johnson. David, I want to start with you. We mentioned you represent 15 Yemeni detainees. You also represented 2 of the 6 Yemenis who were released and sent back to Yemen on the 18th. You know, in light of seeing this connection to 2 Yemenis released from Gitmo, tied to this alleged bomber on Christmas Day, you got a lot of people really, really scared, specifically about those clients that you represent.
Well, the clients that I represent were determined not to be any danger to the United States after an exhaustive interagency review by President Obama's Guantanamo task force. They've simply found that there was no evidence to support the claim that they were a threat. The other 2 that you mentioned, I believe, were Saudis who returned to Saudi Arabia and then migrated to Yemen. I think it's a big mistake to conflate what's going on in Yemen, which is quite a serious problem, with the issue of Yemenis at Guantanamo. As you say, they constitute nearly half of the prisoner population, and if anybody's against closing Guantanamo, the best way to do it is to keep the Yemenis from leaving.
You're saying your clients were deemed not a threat?
That's exactly right. President Obama set up a Guantanamo task force in his January 22nd executive order. It consists of the Defense Department, the CIA, the Justice Department, all interested agency stakeholders. They've reviewed the files of every single man in great detail, all of the evidence, and they have approved for transfer a certain number of men who included my clients as well as the other 6 who were released. This is not a careless process. It's far more rigorous, in fact, than the process that was put in place by President Bush.
Larry Johnson, what's your response?
Well, one of the problems with Guantanamo has been that it is correct that there were several people who were picked up in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 overseas in Afghanistan, Pakistan border, who were victims of being, the United States put out a bounty, about $25,000 a head for any Al-Qaeda operatives, and there were some enterprising Afghan entrepreneurs who went out and just grabbed people off the street, said, hey, these are Al-Qaeda, turned them in. Some of those people got into the system. But there are also some genuinely bad people down there. I think one of the things that has to take place is we need to get this out of partisan politics. Because, you know, I don't think the previous administration wanted to jeopardize American safety, and I don't think the current administration wants to jeopardize American safety. But however, when you try to deal with this issue of Guantanamo, it becomes partisanly charged. And so I think it would be better served if President Obama, for example, had set up a genuine bipartisan high-profile commission of some very respected people from both sides of the political spectrum. Because there are some individuals at Guantanamo, I know this from a friend of mine who ran the facility, that they shouldn't be there and they ought to be released. There are some others that ought to be brought into a military tribunal process. I think as Americans, what we ought to avoid is we don't want to be like the Soviet Union or Communist China. Back in the day of the Cold War, they could declare somebody an enemy of the state, hold them indefinitely. We don't want to hold people indefinitely. We ought to make sure that anybody who's there knows why they're there. And, you know, I'm not saying necessarily read them their Miranda rights, but we ought to have a judicial process of some sort, preferably under military control, to adjudicate this, to make sure that the bad guys are off the street, they're either incarcerated or executed, and that the ones who are innocent are freed.
Now, taking that all into account, we're still looking at 2 guys that were released from Gitmo and now are being tied to this alleged bomber on Christmas Day. And I look at what your clients are being accused of, David, being tied to Al-Qaeda, helping Taliban fighters, being bodyguards to Osama bin Laden. I mean, it's obvious that they did something. They raised red flags somewhere, and they were put there at Gitmo for a reason. I mean, it's very possible they're absolute angels. I mean, obviously, you know, I have no idea. However, the chances are pretty slim when you look at the charges against them.
Well, those are only charges. All of the evidence that the government has, it's kept secret. When courts have looked at this evidence, they've decided in 4 out of 5 cases that the U.S. had no reason to detain these people in the first place. high government officials like Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, said that the vetting process in Afghanistan and Pakistan was awful, and that many of the men, most of the men as far as I'm concerned, were scooped up like fish in a net and then brought to Guantanamo.
Okay.
I guess any way you look at it, there's no guarantees. So, Larry, let me bring it back to you.
Right.
In light of what we are seeing right now and what we're learning about Yemen, what we already know about Yemen,
right.
and the turmoil that it's in, it's a breeding ground for Al-Qaida. There are so many connections to Yemen and terrorism. So you start talking about more of these individuals being released and seeing what happened recently where these two are tied to the most recent example of Christmas Day. Are you concerned?
Well, I'm actually a little heartened. There's some good, the good news out of this terrorist attempt on Christmas Day is the United States was trying, my understanding, up to 3 months ago to try to launch some military operations in Yemen against terrorist targets, and the government of Yemen was not cooperating. They did finally agree to cooperate a few weeks back in mid-December. But now with this group coming out and boldly taking credit for it and putting themselves out front, it's really put the Yemenis in a position that they have to now cooperate and really put their cards on the table. Now, we shouldn't harbor any illusions. Let's remember the government of Yemen also released the bomber of the USS Cole. They didn't do a good job of holding and keeping that person in jail. And when you pick beneath the surface of Yemen, you get into these tribal, ethnic, family groups, and they keep constantly changing allegiances. So, you know, we're working a little bit with a massive jello that keeps moving around. But for at least the short term now, I think we're going to have a much better position to go in, root out what remains of this Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula leadership, to try to kill them, put them on the run, not give them any rest where they can sit around and train. So I think it buys us some time and gives Yemen a chance to figure out which side they want to play on.
Larry Johnson, David Reams. Thanks, gentlemen.